Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Dr. Robin Renee Sanders, and I'm currently the CEO of FEEEDS, which is an advocacy initiative looking at global issues around the world, particularly development issues, and advocating for them. And one of the things that I did as a diplomat, U.S. diplomat for 20 years, is I tended to focus on political and economic issues, which was part of my job. But what I realized and want to share with you today was that I wasn't paying as much attention as I should have been to cultural practices, the rituals, the songs, what they meant. And what I want to share with you today is that we have this challenge in our global community. There's about 6,000 plus languages, words associated with cultural practices, and the artistic motifs and patterns themselves that are endangered today. Think about that number, 6,000. I know that when I say the word extinction, many of you might have the same emotive reaction to the word extinction that I do. You know that civilizations are bygone. There are lots of civilizations that we've either seen or read about that no longer exist today. And the message and the takeaway today is we have that same challenge with endangered cultural practices and their artistic motifs and the languages and the songs that go along with them. And when you think about that, if I were to tell you that in December 2016, the mighty giraffe that I had an opportunity to see in Kenya and Southern Africa was put on the endangered species list. But we don't have a same kind of list globally for endangered practices, their songs, their rituals, and even the words associated with them. So what happens when these things disappear? It means that they are gone forever, that we lose something as humankind and as a global community. What I learned when I was doing my research on this at Robert Morris University in Pittsburgh was that there's this transcendental moment that takes place. Nobody says, let's not teach this anymore. Nobody says these words are not useful to our community anymore. It just sort of happens. And that period of time is called moribund. And I know that we all know what the word moribund means. But in this particular case, for cultural practices and their artistic motifs, the word moribund means it's no longer being taught to the next generation. So whatever that vanguard generation is, whether they're in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s, or even in their 80s, the practice, the words, the rituals, and the songs are no longer being taught to that next generation, which means that when that vanguard generation moves on to walk with the ancestor, those words, those rituals, those artistic cultural practices disappear. So the example that I want to talk to you about in depth, my own personal experience with it, is called Uli. And it was traditionally done by the Igbo of southeastern Nigeria, what was traditionally their homeland area. But in general, worldwide, you have really two types of communities that tend to be in this situation. You have hunter and gathering communities. Yes, there are a few of them still left in the world. I've had the honor, and I consider it an honor, to have been in pygmy villages in Central Africa, in the Republic of Congo, in Bushman communities in the Kalahari Desert in Southern Africa. But we also have them here in the United States, particularly Native Alaskan communities like the Inupiat in North Alaska in the Barrow area. And then you, of course, have them in the Amazon, and you have them in Southeast Asia, in places like Australia as well. The Uli example I'm going to highlight to you today, and you see some of the wonderful, creative, and artistic motifs that are part of this ritual, I think is a good example because it has a number of elements. When you think of cultural practices and patterns, it includes a lot of things: the rituals, the songs, the dance, and the words. And Uli has all of those things. You will meet some of the women that I had the honor to hear their life stories about Uli with. I call them legends because they were in a situation where they were trying to protect something extremely important to them that they had learned from their mothers and their grandmothers. Uli is a matriarchal practice. It is done on the body. It is done on the walls of deity shrines. And for me, it was a very emotive experience to hear these women talk about how something very important to them was being lost. And so I call them legends because they were fighting this taboo, not only of modernization encroaching on their environmental habitat, because they had spiritual connections to animals and flora and fauna and reptiles, but they also had it to deities, things that they worshiped that were part of their spiritual awakening. So these were the challenges they faced, and I consider them legends because they were trying their very best to hold on to something that was historically important to them. So when I talk to you about Uli today, it is several things. It is the overall cultural practice, of course. It is the plant. The plant itself is called Uli, from which the ink is made, from which the motifs then are made, that are then celebrated in the rituals and the song and the dance. And these are the things that are disappearing in that 6,000 plus number that I shared with you in the beginning. So listen to Lebe. Madame Lebe is in her late 80s. She's telling me there about her mother and her grandmother and the communal activities. I was accepted into the village, and that's something that was really an honor for me to be accepted into the village. You see Madame Martina then practicing. You hear the wonderful celebratory music and dancing that is the start of the activity. I wanted to feel what the motifs and the ink felt like on my hand. And Madame Lebe is there putting the motif on my hand. And then, of course, at the end, there is the celebration, the dance for an activity that is considered a celebratory activity. Uli is never done for sad occasions. It's always done for joyous occasions, like the planting season, like the harvest season, like the beginning of the new year. In the Igbo traditional calendar, there are only 7 months in a new year. And for naming ceremonies for a new child born into the village. So I had an opportunity to go to 4 villages and meet the women that I call legends. You've already met Madame Lebe, and you'll meet the others as well. Getting to the villages, very difficult environment, very difficult to get there, very difficult environments that these women live in on a daily basis. In the first village, the motifs were about reptiles. They celebrated the reptiles and the flora and fauna in their area because that's where they believed the spirits lived. And it was very, very important to them in terms of keeping these motifs alive. Remember the songs, remember the music, remember the history. Here she's putting the kola nut on my hand, which is a traditional acceptance by an Igbo village that you are welcome into the village. It represents Igbo unity, it represents hospitality, and you see her very delicate Uli motifs in that picture there, which I learned how to draw. I learned how to draw all the symbols that you saw today because I felt that for me to really understand, not only did I need to feel it, I need to understand how to make them, how to draw them, and I did that. Second village was called Inri, and their celebratory motifs were a little bit different. They were huge. They were 6 feet tall, actually, and they were around deity shrines. In this particular case, you see the motifs behind me. Their deity was the python, and the python was to celebrate the beginning of the new year, the harvest season, the planting season, all the joyous occasions of a village. The last 2 women you're going to meet, Madame Martina and Madame Isafo, for me, they had the most difficult challenge because in their case, they didn't have 2, 3, 4 other women with them in the community who were still practicing. They were by themselves. I used to call them the solo courage of Uli in their villages. And they're facing the taboos that I talked to you about, that this is a pagan activity, so we don't want to move it forward. We don't want to share that with the next generation. And you see she had very delicate, very delicate motifs that represented the historical economic practice of her village, which is palm wine. You see the calabash there. It is the dual razors for circumcision during a naming ceremony in a village. And the last woman that I met and had an opportunity to hear her story is Madame Isafo. And what touched me about Madame Isafo and also Madame Martina is they were facing these taboos by themselves. Madame Martina told me the story that her daughter wouldn't even come near the kitchen that she was refurbishing every year with the Uli motifs. She was by herself. And I actually had an opportunity to witness that because as she was telling me this story, there were two women on their way to do fishing. And when they saw her practicing and putting Uli on her home, they both stopped in their tracks like they were going to be tainted by this horrible activity. And they made this wide swath around her so they wouldn't be tainted by it. Madame Isafo had the same challenge being by herself in her village. In fact, her family tore down her traditional clay home and they put up the cement structure that you see there behind her. And they thought, if we do this, she will not practice anymore because she can't put these motifs on a cement structure. And I remember her chuckling to me when she was telling me this story, saying, I fooled them all. I still was able to put Uli on my home. And you see the signs and symbols there on her home. And she asked me to take an official pose, an official picture of her, which is what's there. Because she said, I want to be remembered for this Uli when I pass on. And she passed on to walk with the ancestors in 2014. And I sent this picture and that quote back to her village so that it would appear in her obituary because I promised her that I would always advocate for disappearing and endangered signs and symbols. Her patterns look more like this, like it was a complete textile. And this is made from cassava paste, which is like a yam in the US context, and from the natural plant indigo. Both things in particular grow in the southeastern part of Nigeria, but indigo is another endangered plant, just like Uli is an endangered plant. So it made me think, how far could I find any reference to Uli? And I was able to go back to 1745, and I found a journal written by, as luck would have it, a Nigerian who had been taken from his village in 1745. He thinks he's about 9 years old at that time. He was taken to the Caribbean in the slave trade and then on to Britain, where his master then taught him how to read and write. So he started writing this journal to try to remember his history. And in the first chapter, he references Uli and how important it was to his mother, to the community, to the women, all of that. And it was very, very important for me to understand that how deep it was embedded in the community. And some of the research shows that it goes back way into the 1600s and earlier. Every time in life, every now and then, we have a concentric circle moment. And when I went to the new Smithsonian Museum of African History and Art, when you go through the first chamber there, it's about the slave trade. And the first name on the wall was the same young man that I had read the journal of 1745, Oludao Ikino. And that was a very emotive concentric circle moment for me. So this goes back to show you just how important these things are. And I think that, when you think about all of the cultural practices and patterns that are in jeopardy today, that 6,000 number, I hope that we as a community take that as seriously as we take the extinction and the endangerment of animal life and wildlife. And I would like to see us do the same kind of thing, to have an endangered list of languages, practices, and their patterns. Thank you.